Detective Frank carried the weight of many cases, but none had pierced him so personally, so deeply, as the one that began in the shadow of his own profound grief. The family was already cloaked in mourning, gathered for the funeral of his beloved daughter, a loss that had carved a void in their lives. The atmosphere was one of shared sorrow, a fragile attempt at comfort amidst unbearable pain. Yet beneath this veneer of collective bereavement, an even more unspeakable horror was taking root, or perhaps had been festering unnoticed for far too long. He remembered the chilling realization that even as they mourned one life, another, that of his innocent granddaughter, was ensnared in a betrayal so vile it defied comprehension, orchestrated by a figure who should have been a pillar of trust, her own grandfather. The path to this truth was one he, as both a grieving father and a seasoned investigator, would be forced to walk, a path that would lead through unimaginable darkness before any semblance of justice could be sought. Malice, he knew, often wore the most familiar faces, and this case would prove to be the most devastating testament to that bitter truth. The days leading up to his daughter, Sarah's funeral, were a blur of suffocating grief for Detective Frank. Each condolence, each shared memory, felt like a fresh stab to his already wounded heart. He who had faced down hardened criminals and stared into the abyss of human cruelty countless times, found himself utterly disarmed by this personal devastation. The church was filled with somber faces, the air thick with unspoken sorrow and the scent of lilies. He stood, a pillar of forced composure beside his grieving wife, his gaze often drifting to his young granddaughter Lily, who seemed a fragile echo of the daughter he had just lost. During the service, amidst the eulogies and hymns, a disquiet settled over him, a feeling separate from the overwhelming sadness. It was an investigator's unease, an almost imperceptible discord in the expected rhythm of grief. He observed his father-in-law, George, Sarah's father, a man usually stoic and reserved. George's displays of sorrow seemed performative at moments, then overly intense at others. Frank initially dismissed it as the unpredictable nature of grief. After all, George had lost his only child. Yet a small insistent voice in the back of his mind, the one honed by years of sifting truth from deception, noted a fleeting glance here, a slightly too tight grip on Lily's shoulder there. These were mere flickers, easily ignored, yet they registered. He tried to push these thoughts away, attributing them to his own fractured emotional state. His world had been upended. Perhaps he was seeing shadows where there were none, but the doubt, once seeded, began to quietly, stubbornly linger. He found himself watching George more closely during the committal at the cemetery, a cold knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the finality of laying Sarah to rest. It was a chilling premonition, a sense that another darker storm was gathering on the horizon, even as they stood in the eye of this one. The final shovelfuls of earth fell with a sickening thud, each one a punctuation mark on Sarah's tragically shortened life. As the small crowd began to disperse, a heavy silence hung over the cemetery, broken only by muted sobs. Detective Frank remained, rooted to the spot, his wife, Eleanor, leaning heavily against him, her own grief a palpable weight. His gaze, however, kept returning to Lily, who stood a little apart with George. His father-in-law had his arm around Lily's shoulders, speaking to her in low tones. Frank noticed Lily looked small and pale, her usual childhood spark extinguished not just by her mother's death but by something else. Something he couldn't yet name. George then suggested taking Lily for a short walk among the older headstones, away from the immediate rawness of the fresh grave, to give her a change of scenery, a moment of peace. Frank felt a prickle of that same unease from the church. It seemed an odd suggestion, a strange detour in the landscape of their sorrow. He watched them walk away, George's hand now firmly on Lily's back, guiding her. They were gone for perhaps 10 minutes, an eternity in Frank's heightened state of awareness. When they returned, Lily's face was ashen. She avoided looking at anyone, her eyes wide and fixed on some distant point. She immediately pulled away from George and rushed to Eleanor, burying her face in her mother's side, her small body trembling. Eleanor, attempting to soothe her, gently stroked her hair. Then Lily whispered something, her voice barely audible. Frank saw Eleanor's expression shift from maternal concern to confusion, then to a dawning, horrified disbelief. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting towards Frank, wide with a terror that mirrored the cold dread now gripping his own heart. Eleanor pulled him aside, her voice a ragged, choked whisper. "Frank, Lily. She said Grandpa George hurt her. In the little stone house in the mausoleum. She's bleeding, Frank." The words hung in the air, obscene and impossible, yet Eleanor's stricken face, the tremor in Lily's small frame, and the sudden, chilling memory of George's intense, proprietary gaze on his granddaughter began to coalesce into a truth more monstrous than any he had encountered in his long career. The ground beneath Frank's feet seemed to tilt. His daughter was newly buried, and now this. The horror was no longer dawning. It had arrived, a tidal wave threatening to consume what little remained of his shattered world. For a moment, Detective Frank felt the world stop. The raw, visceral grief for Sarah warred with a new, incandescent rage and a sickening wave of revulsion. His training, however, kicked in with brutal efficiency, a cold shield against the emotional onslaught. He looked over at George, who was now standing near the cemetery gates, looking out towards the road, perhaps waiting for his car. The man appeared outwardly calm, the picture of a bereaved father and grandfather. The earlier observations Frank had made, the slightly too intense sorrow, the proprietary way he handled Lily, now replayed in his mind, painted in a grotesque new light. The veil of kinship, of shared grief, was ripped away, revealing a monster lurking beneath. This wasn't just a crime. It was a desecration of everything sacred: family, trust, innocence, and even the sanctity of their shared mourning. George, who should have been a protector, a source of comfort for Lily in the wake of her mother's death, had instead become her tormentor. The deception was profound, the betrayal absolute. Frank's mind raced, piecing together a horrifying narrative. The walk among the headstones, the moment of peace in the mausoleum. It was a calculated opportunity, a monstrous exploitation of a child's vulnerability amidst overwhelming sorrow. He felt a surge of self-loathing for not seeing it sooner, for not trusting those initial faint alarm bells. But there was no time for recrimination now. His first priority was Lily. He instructed Eleanor, his voice low and firm, to take Lily directly to their car, to lock the doors, and to wait for him. He needed to ensure her immediate safety, to get her away from this place, away from him. Then his attention snapped back to George. The man was still by the gate, seemingly oblivious. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs, a mixture of fury and a chilling resolve. He was no longer just a grieving father, he was a police officer, and a heinous crime had been committed. The fact that the perpetrator was his father-in-law, standing mere feet from where they had just buried his daughter, made the impending confrontation almost unbearable, yet utterly necessary. The grandfather, the trusted elder, had shown his true face, and it was the face of a predator. If you also believe that no crime should go unpunished, consider subscribing to the channel to follow every archived case. Your support is crucial. Detective Frank moved with a grim, deliberate purpose. After ensuring Eleanor and Lily were secure in the car, he made the most difficult call of his career. His voice, usually steady and authoritative, was strained as he requested a child protection unit and a forensic team to the cemetery. He gave his location, his name, and then the gut-wrenching detail. The suspect was his father-in-law, the victim his granddaughter. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy before professionalism took over. While waiting, Frank approached the mausoleum. The heavy stone door was slightly ajar. He didn't enter immediately, his training dictating he preserve the scene, but his mind was a maelstrom. How long had this been going on? Was this monstrous act at his daughter's funeral an isolated incident, a grotesque impulse born of some twisted grief, or was it the tip of an iceberg, a secret history of abuse that had remained hidden within the family? The thought that his own daughter Sarah might have endured something similar, something he had been blind to, was a fresh wave of agony. He recalled instances over the years, Lily's occasional unexplained fearfulness around George, moments of withdrawal he had dismissed as childhood shyness. Sarah herself had sometimes seemed strained around her father, an undercurrent he had never probed deeply enough. Had he failed them both? The quiet solitude of the cemetery, once a place of solemn remembrance, now felt charged with a sickening energy. Every shadow seemed to whisper of unspeakable things. He thought of Lily, so small, so vulnerable, her innocence shattered in the most brutal way imaginable, by a man she called Grandpa. The bleeding Eleanor had mentioned was a stark, physical confirmation of the violation. The investigation, he knew, would have to be meticulous, unsparing even if it tore his family apart. He would have to delve into George's past, re-examine every interaction, every casual comment, every family gathering, searching for the subtle signs he had missed. The truth, he suspected, would be far more extensive and devastating than the horror of this single terrible day. What detail of this dawning investigation shocks you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read all of them. The arrival of the forensic team and child protection services was a grim comfort to Detective Frank. He watched, detached yet intimately connected, as they began their work. The mausoleum, a small cold stone structure meant to house the dead, became the focal point of a horrifyingly alive investigation. Frank briefed the lead investigator, Detective Miller, a seasoned officer from the sex crimes unit, trying to keep his voice even, professional, despite the turmoil raging within him. He recounted Lily's whispered words to Eleanor, the visible distress, the blood. Miller listened intently, his expression unreadable but conveying a quiet competence. The forensic team, clad in their sterile suits, moved methodically. They photographed the exterior and interior of the mausoleum, dusting for prints, searching for any trace evidence. Frank pointed out the path George and Lily had taken. It was inside the mausoleum that the most damning, heartbreaking evidence was found. On the cold stone floor, near a dusty, forgotten bench, the team discovered fresh bloodstains, small crimson smears that told a silent, terrible story. They also found a small discarded piece of fabric, torn from a child's dress. Lily's dress, the one she wore to her mother's funeral. Each piece of evidence was a nail in George's coffin, but also a fresh stab of pain for Frank. This wasn't speculation anymore, not a misunderstanding or a child's confused account. This was cold, hard, irrefutable proof of a monstrous act. The investigators also carefully collected samples from Lily's clothing, which Eleanor had tearfully provided. The child protection specialist, a kind but firm woman named Ms. Albright, had already begun the delicate process of speaking with Lily, ensuring she felt safe and supported, preparing for the difficult interview that would be necessary. Frank knew that Lily's testimony, combined with the physical evidence, would be crucial. The scene at the graveside, a place of final goodbyes, had yielded a discovery that marked the beginning of a new, terrible chapter. The truth, in its stark, ugly reality, was laid bare on the cold stone of that mausoleum. Malice, as Frank had always known, could hide in the most ordinary of places, even within the supposed sanctity of a family grave. With the preliminary forensic findings confirming the unspeakable, Detective Miller gave Frank a grim nod. It was time. George was still near the cemetery entrance, leaning against his car, perhaps growing impatient or wondering about the delay. Frank watched him for a moment. A man who had just buried his daughter, a man who should have been consumed by grief, yet who had committed an act of profound evil. The duality was nauseating. Frank, accompanied by Miller and two uniformed officers who had arrived discreetly, walked towards George. The remaining few mourners, lingering in the distance, turned to watch, their curiosity piqued by the official presence. As they approached, George straightened up, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossing his face. "Frank, what's going on? Is everything all right with Lily?" he asked, his voice feigning concern. "George," Frank began, his own voice devoid of any warmth, any familial connection. It was the voice of Detective Frank, the lawman. "George, you are under arrest for the aggravated sexual assault of a child." The color drained from George's face. His eyes darted around, from Frank to Miller to the uniformed officers. "What? This is absurd, a mistake. I'm her grandfather. I just lost my daughter." His voice rose in feigned outrage, but there was a tremor of fear beneath it. "The evidence suggests otherwise, George," Miller stated calmly but firmly, as one of the officers moved to cuff him. George began to struggle, protesting his innocence, his voice growing louder, attracting more attention. "You can't do this. I'm a grieving father. This is insane." The scene was surreal, the quiet solemnity of the cemetery shattered by the ugly reality of an arrest. The other mourners looked on in stunned disbelief. A respected member of their community, a man known for his quiet demeanor, being handcuffed at his own daughter's funeral, accused of such a heinous crime against his granddaughter. The arrest, right there at the cemetery gates, sent ripples of shock not just through the remaining family and friends, but soon through the entire town. Frank watched, his heart a block of ice, as George was read his rights and placed into a police car. There was no satisfaction, only a profound, soul-crushing sadness. Justice had begun its slow, painful march, but the wounds inflicted were immeasurable. Did you already suspect the true culprit? Tell me in the comments at what point your suspicions were raised. The drive away from the cemetery was a blur of conflicting emotions for Detective Frank. Eleanor sat beside him, tears streaming silently down her face, while Lily, wrapped in a blanket in the back seat, was mercifully asleep, exhausted by the trauma. The family, already fractured by Sarah's death, was now utterly decimated by George's betrayal. The trust, the shared history, the very fabric of their lives had been torn to shreds. Frank knew the road ahead would be excruciating. There would be interrogations, court appearances, the inevitable public scrutiny, and the deep, personal work of helping Lily heal from wounds no child should ever have to bear. His duty as a detective had forced him to confront an evil that resided within his own family circle, a truth that would forever haunt him. The image of George, the grieving patriarch morphing into a monstrous predator, would be seared into his memory. He thought of Sarah's mother, George's wife, who was not present at the funeral due to her own frail health. How would she react to this news? The devastation would ripple outwards, destroying more than just their immediate family. Frank felt an immense weight of responsibility, not just for bringing George to justice, but for protecting Lily, for trying to piece back together some semblance of a normal life for her, for Eleanor, and for himself. The investigation would continue, of course. They would delve deeper into George's past, searching for any other victims, any prior indications of this darkness. Malice, Frank knew, rarely confined itself to a single act, but for now, his focus was on his granddaughter. The legal battle would be fought by others, but the battle for Lily's future, for her ability to trust and to feel safe again, that was a fight he and Eleanor would have to lead. The scars of this betrayal would run deep, a permanent stain on their family history. The father in him grieved for his daughter, for his granddaughter's stolen innocence, and for the family that was no more. The detective in him knew he had done what was necessary, but the cost was almost too much to bear. The wheels of justice, though often slow, did turn. George, confronted with the irrefutable forensic evidence, and Lily's brave, though traumatizing testimony, was eventually convicted. He received a lengthy prison sentence, ensuring he would never harm another child. But for Detective Frank and his family, the verdict offered little solace. Justice, in a courtroom, is a legal construct. It cannot erase the trauma, cannot mend the shattered trust, nor can it bring back the innocence that was stolen. The community was rocked by the revelation, struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, grieving grandfather with the convicted predator. Some refused to believe it, a testament to how effectively monsters can hide behind masks of normalcy. Years passed. Lily, with intensive therapy and the unwavering love of Frank and Eleanor, began to heal. The scars remained, as they always do, but she grew into a resilient young woman, a survivor. Frank never truly recovered from the dual blow of losing his daughter and uncovering such profound evil within his own family. It cast a long shadow over his remaining years on the force and into his retirement. He often reflected on the case, not with any sense of triumph, but with a deep, abiding sorrow. It taught him the harshest of lessons, that the capacity for darkness can reside anywhere, even in the most sacred of familial bonds, and that sometimes the most difficult truths are found closest to home. The veneer of civilization is thin, and the pursuit of truth, while necessary, can exact a terrible price. This case, above all others, reminded him that even when justice is served, the echoes of such profound betrayal linger, a haunting reminder of the fragility of innocence and the enduring nature of evil. If stories like this make you think, share this video. Sometimes awareness is the first form of prevention, and don't forget to leave your like.